Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Pensacola. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1837 when the disappearance occurred. Pensacola, Florida Territory, was still adjusting to American governance, having been ceded by Spain just 16 years prior. The port city, with its strategic harbor on the Gulf of Mexico, maintained a peculiar character. Spanish architecture and customs persisted alongside new American influences, creating a place caught between worlds. This duality extended beyond mere aesthetics. It penetrated the very soul of the community. On the outskirts of town, approximately 3 miles north along the Escambia Bay, stood Magnolia Hill, the Leighton plantation house. White columns punctuated its facade, giving it an air of southern prosperity that concealed the darkness within its walls. The property encompassed nearly 400 acres of pine forests, cotton fields, and marshy lowlands stretching toward the water. It was on November 12th of that year, during an unseasonably cold autumn, that Lenora Duvalier was reported missing from the Leighton plantation. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance would remain shrouded in whispers for over a century, until a collection of documents emerged in 1963, casting a disturbing light on what may have transpired. According to public records from the time, Lenora Duvalier was listed as a 24-year-old free woman of color from New Orleans, who had been employed as a house servant at Magnolia Hill for approximately 6 months before her disappearance. This, however, was merely the official narrative, a convenient explanation that satisfied local authorities enough to close their cursory investigation after just 2 weeks. The property belonged to Tobias Leighton, a 42-year-old widower who had inherited the plantation from his father-in-law following the death of his wife during childbirth 3 years prior. Leighton was described in contemporary accounts as a man of refined sensibilities and education, though possessing a certain remoteness of character that discouraged intimate acquaintance. He lived alone with his 3-year-old daughter, Eleanor, and a household staff of 15 enslaved persons and 2 free employees, including Lenora. When questioned about the disappearance, Leighton reported that Lenora had simply failed to appear for her duties one morning. Her personal belongings remained in her quarters, including a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman presumed to be her mother. No one reported seeing her leave the property. No one admitted to hearing anything unusual the night before. The investigation concluded that she had likely fled, despite leaving behind her few possessions. The case might have remained nothing more than a footnote in local records had it not been for the discovery of a collection of documents during renovations to the old Pensacola courthouse in 1963. Hidden within a sealed compartment in a desk that had once belonged to Judge William Patterson, who presided over the territorial court in 1837, was a leather portfolio containing private correspondence, unofficial testimonies, and the judge's personal notes on several cases, including Lenora's disappearance. What follows is an account reconstructed from these documents and other historical records that paint a much more disturbing picture of the events at Magnolia Hill. As we piece together this narrative, remember that these events occurred in the darkest corners of American history, in spaces where human dignity was routinely violated and where certain truths remained deliberately unspoken. The first peculiarity noted in Judge Patterson's private papers was that Lenora Duvalier had not sought employment at Magnolia Hill. Rather, she had arrived there under circumstances that even the judge found troubling. According to a letter from Patterson's cousin in New Orleans, Lenora had been living as a free woman of color in the French Quarter, working as a seamstress with a respectable clientele. Her sudden departure for Pensacola had surprised her acquaintances, particularly since she had recently become engaged to a carpenter named Martin Beaufort. Patterson's notes indicated that Lenora had received a letter, purportedly from a maternal aunt living in Pensacola, claiming to be gravely ill and requesting Lenora's presence. Upon arriving in Pensacola, however, Lenora discovered that the address provided belonged to a boarding house where no such aunt had ever resided. With her funds depleted by the journey and finding herself stranded in an unfamiliar city, she sought assistance from local authorities. It was at this point that Tobias Layton entered the narrative. Judge Patterson's notes mention that Layton happened to be conducting business at the courthouse when Lenora arrived seeking help. He offered her temporary employment at his plantation until she could earn enough to return to New Orleans. The judge wrote that he found the coincidence convenient to the point of suspicion, but lacking evidence of wrongdoing, he did not pursue the matter further. What Judge Patterson could not have known then, but what his later correspondence suggests he came to suspect, was that Lenora's arrival in Pensacola was no coincidence at all. Among the discovered papers was a draft of a letter from Layton to a business associate in New Orleans, dated 2 months before Lenora's arrival. In it, Layton inquired about a certain seamstress of mixed parentage, said to possess extraordinary skills and a refined manner, who frequents the establishment of Madame Rousseau on Conti Street. The description matched what was known of Lenora and her clientele. The early weeks of Lenora's employment at Magnolia Hill appeared uneventful, at least according to the official household ledger that recorded the duties and performance of staff. She was assigned to care for Layton's young daughter, Eleanor, and to attend to the mending of household linens. The ledger entries described her as diligent, proper in deportment, and possessing a calming influence on the child. However, a different account emerges from the fragmentary journal of Martha Lewis, an elderly enslaved woman who worked in the kitchen at Magnolia Hill. 3 pages of this journal, written in a barely literate hand on scraps of paper and sewn into the lining of a kitchen apron, were discovered during an inventory of artifacts donated to the Pensacola Historical Society in 1958. The donor, an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins, claimed to be the granddaughter of Martha Lewis and had preserved the apron as a family heirloom, unaware of its hidden contents until the fabric began to deteriorate. Martha's writings suggest that Lenora's position in the household was immediately complicated by Layton's unusual attention. "Master watches the New Orleans woman when she tends to the child," one entry reads. "He stands in doorways and behind curtains. His eyes follow her movements in a manner that causes discomfort among the house staff. The child, however, has grown attached to her, calling for Nora even in her sleep." Another entry, dated approximately 1 month after Lenora's arrival, states, "The master instructed that Miss Lenora's quarters be moved from the servants' wing to the room adjoining the nursery, claiming it would allow her to better attend to the child during the night." The room was previously the mistress's dressing room and still contains many of her personal effects. Miss Lenora appeared troubled by the arrangement, but did not openly object. Martha's journal also records increasing tension within the household. Miss Lenora requested permission to send correspondence to New Orleans. The master denied this request, stating that all household communication must pass through him to ensure the security of his business affairs. She did not raise the matter again in my presence, but her demeanor has changed. She watches the roads whenever she takes the child for walks in the garden. The most disturbing entry, dated just 1 week before Lenora's disappearance, reads, "Miss Lenora confided in me today while collecting herbs from the kitchen garden. She believes the master intercepted a letter sent to her from New Orleans. She appeared greatly distressed and mentioned a fiancé who would surely come looking for her. She asked if I knew of anyone traveling to Mobile who might carry a message for her. I was forced to decline, knowing the punishment that would follow such an action. She touched my hand in understanding, but the fear in her eyes has remained with me through my prayers. This final journal entry suggests that Lenora was not planning to flee, but was instead seeking to establish contact with her fiancé in New Orleans, possibly to secure her departure from Magnolia Hill. This contradicts Leighton's claim to investigators that Lenora had given no indication of dissatisfaction with her position. The night before Lenora's disappearance coincided with a dinner party hosted by Leighton for several prominent Pensacola businessmen. According to household records, the gathering concluded around midnight, with all guests departing except for Dr. Alexander Wilson, who reportedly stayed behind to discuss a medical matter with Leighton. Dr. Wilson would later become a figure of interest in Judge Patterson's unofficial inquiry. The doctor maintained that he left Magnolia Hill shortly after the other guests, around 12:30, and rode directly to his home in Pensacola. However, a statement given to Patterson by Isaiah Cooper, a fisherman who was setting crab traps in Escambia Bay that night, contradicted this account. Cooper claimed that around 2 o'clock in the morning, he observed a carriage matching the description of Dr. Wilson's traveling away from the direction of Magnolia Hill on the seldom-used North Bayshore Road. The carriage moved slowly, as if heavily laden, and stopped briefly at a wooden bridge spanning a creek that fed into the bay. Cooper reported seeing a man resembling Dr. Wilson exit the carriage, lean over the bridge railing for several minutes, and then continue his journey toward town. When confronted with this testimony by Patterson in an unofficial capacity, Dr. Wilson allegedly amended his statement to say that he had indeed taken the longer Bayshore route home because the main road was muddy from recent rains, and I feared for my horse's footing in the darkness. He denied stopping at any point during the journey. No further action was taken regarding this discrepancy, as Patterson lacked official grounds to pursue the matter. The morning after the dinner party, Lenora was discovered to be missing from her room. Eleanor Leighton, the 3-year-old child, was found alone in her nursery, unusually subdued. When household staff inquired about Lenora's whereabouts, Tobias Leighton reportedly stated that she had expressed dissatisfaction the previous evening and had likely returned to New Orleans. When reminded that her belongings remained in her room, he suggested that she would send for them once settled. The local sheriff, James Miller, conducted a perfunctory investigation at Leighton's request. His official report noted nothing suspicious about the premises. He questioned the household staff, but recorded no substantive statements. The report concluded, "It appears the woman Lenora Duvalier has absconded of her own volition, perhaps fearing the consequences of some unrevealed misconduct." No evidence of foul play was discovered, and Mr. Leighton expresses only concern for her welfare, having regarded her as a dependable employee. Sheriff Miller's investigation might have been the end of the matter had it not been for a curious incident that occurred 3 weeks later. According to an account in Judge Patterson's papers, he was approached by Elizabeth Wilson, the wife of Dr. Alexander Wilson, who requested a private meeting. During this meeting, she presented the judge with a woman's nightgown that she claimed to have discovered hidden beneath the floorboards of her husband's study. The nightgown, described as finely made of white linen with delicate embroidery at the collar, bore dark stains that Mrs. Wilson believed to be blood. More disturbingly, she had found tucked into its folds a silver locket containing a miniature portrait, a locket matching the description of the one left behind in Lenora's room at Magnolia Hill. Judge Patterson recorded that he advised Mrs. Wilson to return the items to their hiding place and to mention the discovery to no one, not even her husband. He promised to look into the matter discreetly. However, before he could pursue this lead, Elizabeth Wilson was found dead in her bathing tub, an apparent suicide by drowning. Dr. Wilson reported that his wife had been suffering from nervous exhaustion and delusions for several months. The locket and nightgown were never recovered or mentioned in any official documents. Judge Patterson's notes indicate that he visited the Wilson home after Elizabeth's funeral, but found no trace of the items. Dr. Wilson subsequently sold his Pensacola practice and relocated to Mobile, Alabama. In the months following Lenora's disappearance, life at Magnolia Hill appeared to return to normal. Leighton hired a new nursemaid for his daughter, an older woman from a respected local family. He expanded his business interests, investing in a shipping venture with partners in Mobile. By all accounts, he remained a respected, if somewhat reserved, member of Pensacola society. Yet subtle changes were noted by those who knew the household. Martha Lewis's apron contained one final hidden note, dated 6 months after Lenora's disappearance. The child no longer speaks. The master says she is merely being stubborn, but I have seen her staring at the door to her former nurse's room, her small face blank as unfired clay. At night, she often wakes screaming, though no sound passes her lips. The master has forbidden anyone from entering the room where Miss Lenora stayed. He keeps the key on his person at all times. This silence on the part of young Eleanor Leighton would prove to be more than temporary. Historical records indicate that she never spoke another word for the remainder of her life. She was eventually sent to a boarding school in Charleston at the age of 8, where teachers described her as intelligent but unable or unwilling to communicate except through writing. She returned to Magnolia Hill only after her father's death in 1852, inheriting the property but living there as a recluse, managed by trustees until her own death in 1891. Eleanor Leighton died unmarried and childless at the age of 57. Her will contained unusual provisions. The plantation house was to be immediately demolished, its materials sold, and the proceeds donated to an orphanage in New Orleans. The land was to remain unoccupied for a period of 50 years, after which it could be sold, with the stipulation that no structure ever be built within 100 yards of where the main house had stood. These eccentric requirements were honored by her trustees, though they provoked much speculation in the community. The demolition crew reported finding peculiar modifications to the house during their work. A hidden chamber accessible only through a concealed door in the master bedroom closet, containing nothing but a small child's rocking chair and several scratches on the wall at approximately the height of an adult's fingertips. For decades, the former site of Magnolia Hill remained vacant, gradually reclaimed by pine forest and underbrush. Local children told stories of hearing a woman's weeping among the trees, though such tales are common to many abandoned properties throughout the South. More unusual was the persistence with which locals avoided the property, even after restrictions on its use expired in the 1940s. Developers who expressed interest in the land often withdrew their offers after visiting the site, citing various practical concerns, but sometimes admitting to an unaccountable feeling of heaviness that descended upon them there. In 1959, during the construction of a highway that would pass near the former Magnolia Hill property, workers dredging a section of the creek that crossed the land made a disturbing discovery. Beneath the remnants of an old wooden bridge, caught in decades of silt and preserved by the brackish water, they found human remains. The skeleton was determined to be that of a woman in her 20s, with evidence of West African ancestry. A metal object had become fused to the bones of the chest through years of oxidation, a corroded silver locket. The remains were examined by Dr. Harold Jeffries of the University of Florida, who determined that the woman had suffered a severe fracture to the base of the skull before entering the water. In his report, he stated, "The nature of the injury is consistent with a forceful blow from behind with a heavy, blunt object. The fracture pattern suggests the individual was likely facing away from her assailant at the time of impact. Death would have been immediate or nearly so. Due to the age of the remains and the impossibility of establishing a definitive identity using the forensic techniques available in 1959, the case was not reopened. The bones were stored in the university's anthropology department until 1967, when they were transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for further study as part of a broader research project on historical demographics. It was only after the discovery of Judge Patterson's papers in 1963 that connections began to be drawn between the remains found at the creek and the long-forgotten case of Lenora Duvalier. Researchers noted the correspondence between the location of the discovery beneath a bridge on the Bayshore Road and Isaiah Cooper's statement about seeing Dr. Wilson's carriage stop at that very bridge on the night of Lenora's disappearance. Further investigation into historical records revealed additional disturbing details. Dr. Alexander Wilson, after relocating to Mobile, had married 3 more times. All 3 wives died under circumstances that, while not overtly suspicious when viewed individually, formed a troubling pattern when considered together. One from a fall downstairs, one from an apparent accidental poisoning with medicinal laudanum, and one from drowning during a seaside holiday. Wilson himself died in 1871 from what was recorded as apoplexy, likely a stroke. As for Tobias Layton, his life after Lenora's disappearance was outwardly successful but marked by peculiarities. He never remarried, though his social position and wealth would have made him an eligible widower. Household accounts show that he frequently traveled to New Orleans on business, often returning with expensive gifts for his silent daughter. During the final years of his life, he became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving Magnolia Hill and dismissing much of his household staff. The most intriguing document discovered among Judge Patterson's papers was a sealed letter addressed to the judge from Tobias Layton, dated just 1 week before Layton's death in 1852. The letter, which Patterson apparently never opened, contained a full confession. In this remarkable document, Layton admitted to orchestrating Lenora's arrival in Pensacola through false correspondence. He described becoming obsessed with her after seeing her in New Orleans during a business trip, convinced that she bore an uncanny resemblance to his deceased wife. His intention, he claimed, had been only to have her care for his daughter, to maintain some shadow of his wife's presence in the household. But proximity bred greater madness, he wrote. I convinced myself that she returned my affections, though she plainly did not. When I discovered her attempt to contact her fiancé in New Orleans, I realized she planned to leave. I could not bear the thought of losing her, of losing my wife a second time, as my delusion had reconstructed the situation. According to Layton's confession, on the night of the dinner party, he confronted Lenora after the guests had departed, declaring his feelings and proposing marriage. When she refused him and attempted to leave the room, he struck her in a moment of rage, causing her to fall and strike her head against a marble fireplace hearth. Believing her dead or dying, he panicked and sought help from Dr. Wilson, who had remained behind. Wilson, seeing my distress, offered assistance in exchange for my silence regarding certain improprieties I had witnessed in his professional conduct, Layton wrote. Together, we wrapped her body in bed sheets and carried her to his carriage. He assured me he would dispose of her remains in a way that would never be discovered. I did not inquire as to his methods, preferring ignorance to further complicity. The confession continued with a chilling revelation. It was only when Wilson returned, some hours later, that I learned the full horror of what had transpired. Lenora had not been dead when we moved her. She had revived during the journey, causing Wilson to panic and strike her with his medical bag before throwing her, still breathing, from the bridge. He described her attempts to cling to the bridge supports, her fingers scraping the wood as he pried them loose. The current, he assured me, had taken her body out toward the bay. Layton concluded his confession with a reference to his daughter. Eleanor witnessed everything from the shadows of the hallway. She has not spoken since that night. Her eyes hold the judgment I deserve, but have thus far escaped in this world. I write this confession, knowing my days are few, hoping that some measure of justice might yet be served, though I myself will have passed beyond its reach. The confession, had it been delivered and read, might have led to a posthumous investigation of both Leighton and Dr. Wilson. Instead, sealed and forgotten in Judge Patterson's desk, it remained hidden until 1963, by which time all principal figures in the case had long since died. The story of Lenora Duvalier and the tragedy at Magnolia Hill represents more than just an isolated incident of violence. It serves as a stark reminder of the broader systems of oppression that enabled such events to occur and remain largely unaddressed. The vulnerability of free people of color in the antebellum South, the complicity of authority figures in maintaining a veneer of propriety over unspeakable acts, and the generational trauma inflicted by such violence, all are elements of this historical narrative that continue to resonate. Today, the former site of Magnolia Hill is part of a nature preserve. A small marker, erected in 2002 by a local historical society, acknowledges the presence of the plantation without mentioning the specific events that transpired there. Visitors occasionally report an unusual heaviness in the air around the area where the main house once stood, particularly during the early morning hours when mist rises from the creek. Researchers attempting to locate descendants of Lenora Duvalier have thus far been unsuccessful. Records from New Orleans indicate that her fiancé, Martin Beaufort, made inquiries with authorities in Pensacola regarding her disappearance, but was provided with the same explanation given to local officials, that she had likely continued on to Mobile or points further west. Beaufort eventually married another woman and relocated to Haiti in 1840, perhaps carrying with him unanswered questions about Lenora's fate. As for Eleanor Leighton, her decades of silence remain the most poignant testimony to the events at Magnolia Hill. Journals kept during her adult years, preserved in the University of West Florida archives, reveal a woman of considerable intelligence and sensitivity. Though she never directly referenced the events surrounding Lenora's disappearance, her writings frequently return to themes of guilt, witness, and the weight of unspoken truths. In one entry, dated 1870, she wrote, "There are spaces between words where entire worlds exist. In these spaces, I have lived my life. What cannot be spoken shapes us more profoundly than what can. The silence after a scream continues to echo long after the sound itself has died away." Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Lenora Duvalier comes from Eleanor's final journal entry, written just days before her death. "I have arranged for the house to be torn down. May the earth reclaim what rightfully belongs to it. But I know that structures made of wood and stone are not the only dwellings where horror resides. Some houses are built in memory, their foundations laid in the moments that divide our lives into before and after. These cannot be demolished by any earthly means. They stand as monuments to all we could not save, all we failed to protect. I go to my grave, still hearing the sounds from that night, a woman's pleas, a door closing, footsteps fading down the hall, and after, the silence that has defined my existence. The case of Lenora Duvalier was officially closed in 1963 when Judge Patterson's papers were sealed in the state archives, deemed too historically sensitive for public access. They were finally made available to researchers in 1989, by which time the events they described had passed beyond living memory into the realm of history. Yet the emotional impact of this tragedy continues to resonate, reminding us that the past is never truly silent for those willing to listen. In the shadowed corners of America's history, countless stories like Lenora's remain untold or incomplete, their details lost to time or deliberately obscured. It is only through the patient work of historical investigation and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths that we can begin to acknowledge the full human cost of our shared past. As you walk away from this narrative, consider the spaces between the facts presented, the silences that speak volumes, and the echoes that continue to reverberate through time. For in these forgotten histories lie lessons still unlearned, wounds still unhealed, and voices that, though silenced, still demand to be heard. The discovery of human remains beneath the old bridge in 1959 prompted several locals to come forward with stories passed down through generations. Among these was Howard Jenkins, grandson of Sarah Jenkins, who had donated Martha Lewis's apron to the Historical Society. Howard shared a story told by his grandmother about strange occurrences at Magnolia Hill in the years following Lenora's disappearance. According to this oral history, the room that had belonged to Lenora remained locked for years, but servants occasionally reported hearing sounds from within, soft scratching and what some described as whispered counting. When Eleanor Layton returned to the plantation after her father's death, her first act was to enter this room, spending 3 days inside without emerging for food or water. When she finally came out, she ordered all furniture removed and the walls painted black. The room thereafter remained empty but unlocked, and Eleanor would sometimes be found sitting on its floor, writing in her journal by candlelight. Another account came from Thomas Mercer, whose great-grandfather had been part of the demolition crew that tore down Magnolia Hill following Eleanor's death. Mercer claimed that his ancestor had discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of Lenora's room, containing dozens of folded paper birds, each inscribed with a single word. When arranged in a particular order, these words reportedly formed a message. She watches from the water, her eyes never close. The child knows. The credibility of such second-hand accounts is naturally questionable, especially given the tendency toward embellishment in oral histories. However, certain physical evidence lends credence to at least some elements of these stories. During an archaeological survey of the former Magnolia Hill property conducted in 1977, researchers discovered beneath the soil where Lenora's room would have stood a small metal box containing a child's diary. The diary, confirmed through handwriting analysis to belong to young Eleanor Layton, contained entries spanning from just before Lenora's arrival at Magnolia Hill until approximately 1 week after her disappearance. The final entries are particularly disturbing, written in an increasingly erratic hand. November 10th, 1837. Miss Nora showed me how to make birds from paper today. She says each one can carry a wish or a secret. I made one with my wish to visit the ocean someday. She made one too, but wouldn't tell me what she wished. November 11th, 1837. Father is having guests tonight. Miss Nora seems afraid. She told me to stay in my room no matter what sounds I might hear. She gave me her locket to hold until morning and made me promise to remember her always. November 12th, 1837. Miss Nora screamed in the night. I looked through the keyhole and saw Father and Dr. Wilson carrying something wrapped in sheets. There was red on the floor that Martha cleaned before sunrise. Father says Miss Nora has gone away, but her locket is still in my hand. November 13th, 1837. I saw Miss Nora last night, standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was wet, and water dripped onto my quilt. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes looked so sad. I tried to give back her locket, but my hand passed through her hand. The final entry, dated November 19th, consists of a single line. The words won't come anymore. They stay inside where it's safe. Eleanor's childhood diary represents one of the few contemporaneous accounts of the events surrounding Lenora's disappearance. Its discovery prompted renewed interest in the case among historians specializing in antebellum Southern history, particularly those focused on crimes against free people of color that often went uninvestigated or were deliberately covered up. Dr. Marianne Winters, professor of historical criminology at Tulane University, conducted extensive research into the Magnolia Hill case during the 1980s. Her work included analyzing court records, property deeds, medical reports, and other documents from Pensacola and surrounding areas during the relevant time period. Her findings, published in 1987, shed additional light on the circumstances that enabled such a crime to occur and remain largely concealed. According to Dr. Winters' research, Tobias Layton and Dr. Alexander Wilson were not merely acquaintances, but had financial ties dating back several years before Lenora's disappearance. Wilson had treated Layton's wife during her fatal childbirth and subsequently became involved in Layton's shipping business, investing a substantial sum that helped establish a trade route between Pensacola and New Orleans. More significantly, Dr. Winters discovered records indicating that Wilson had been investigated for medical malpractice in Virginia before relocating to Florida Territory. The case involved the death of a young woman under his care, with allegations that he had administered improper treatment and then altered records to conceal his error. Though never formally charged, Wilson left Virginia shortly after the investigation began, reinventing himself in Pensacola as a respected physician. The relationship between Layton and Wilson appears to have been one of mutual compromise, Dr. Winters wrote. Each man possessed knowledge that could damage the other's reputation and standing. This dynamic created a dangerous alliance that ultimately facilitated their collaboration in Lenora Duvalier's death and the subsequent cover-up. The 1980s also saw attempts to locate any surviving relatives of Lenora Duvalier in New Orleans. Genealogists traced records of the Duvalier family, discovering that Lenora had been born to a French merchant father and a mother who had been formerly enslaved but gained her freedom when Lenora was an infant. Both parents died in a yellow fever epidemic when Lenora was 17, leaving her to support herself through her skills as a seamstress. Further research revealed that Lenora's fiancé, Martin Beaufort, had indeed made inquiries in Pensacola regarding her disappearance. A letter from Beaufort to the territorial governor, dated February 1838, was discovered in state archives. In it, he expressed dissatisfaction with the local investigation and requested more thorough inquiry, noting that Lenora had written to him, expressing unease about her situation at Magnolia Hill just 2 weeks before her disappearance. The governor's response, if there was one, has not been preserved. However, court records show that Beaufort filed a civil claim against Tobias Layton in March 1838, alleging wrongful detention and seeking information about Lenora's whereabouts. The case was dismissed by Judge Patterson on grounds of insufficient evidence, with a notation that the plaintiff, being a man of color, lacks standing to bring such charges against a property owner of Mr. Layton's stature without more substantial proof of wrongdoing. This legal barrier, the dismissal of Beaufort's legitimate concerns based partly on his racial status, exemplifies the systemic injustices that allowed crimes against free people of color to go unpunished throughout the antebellum South. Even when evidence existed, as in Lenora's case, social and legal structures often protected white perpetrators while denying justice to victims and their families. Beaufort's subsequent departure for Haiti takes on new significance in this context. Having exhausted legal channels in his search for Lenora, and perhaps facing increasing hostility from those who wished the matter forgotten, he chose exile in a nation founded by formerly enslaved people rather than continue living under a system that denied him both answers and justice. Another dimension of the Magnolia Hill tragedy emerged in 1992 when marine archaeologists surveying Escambia Bay discovered the remains of a 19th-century sailing vessel approximately half a mile from the mouth of the creek where Lenora's remains were found. The vessel, identified as the Caroline Marie based on recovered artifacts, had belonged to Tobias Leighton and was reported lost in a storm in 1840. However, examination of the wreckage suggested that the ship had been deliberately scuttled rather than sunk by natural causes. Most intriguingly, in a sealed compartment in the captain's cabin, divers found a collection of women's clothing and personal items dating from the late 1830s, including several garments matching the style and approximate size that Lenora would have worn. The presence of these items aboard Leighton's vessel raised new questions about his mental state in the years following Lenora's death. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a forensic psychologist consulted during the investigation of the wreckage, suggested that Leighton may have been experiencing what modern psychology would classify as severe obsessive-compulsive behavior coupled with delusional thinking. The evidence suggests that Leighton may have created a shrine of sorts to Lenora aboard his vessel, Dr. Reynolds noted in her assessment. The careful preservation of clothing and personal effects hidden away where no one else would discover them indicates both obsessive attachment and awareness of the inappropriateness of this fixation. The deliberate sinking of the vessel could represent a ritualistic attempt at closure, or conversely, a means of ensuring that his secret obsession remained permanently hidden. This psychological analysis aligns with accounts from Leighton's business associates during his final years. Several letters preserved in the Pensacola Maritime Museum collection describe increasingly erratic behavior, including paranoid accusations that employees were entering his private quarters without permission and claims that he could hear a woman's voice calling from the bay on still nights. In his final year of life, Leighton reportedly refused to travel by water, even though doing so significantly complicated his business affairs. His last will and testament, beyond providing for Eleanor's care, contained unusual provisions, requiring that his body be interred in a lead-lined coffin to ensure that water shall never touch my remains. This specific phobia seems particularly significant given Lenora's fate. Eleanor Leighton's lifelong silence following her childhood trauma presents one of the most poignant aspects of this historical case. Medical records from the Charleston boarding school she attended indicate that physicians examined her extensively, finding no physical cause for her inability to speak. One doctor noted that she would occasionally open her mouth as if to talk, only to close it again with an expression of terror. Despite her silence, Eleanor found other means of expression. Her education was primarily conducted through written correspondence with teachers, and she demonstrated remarkable aptitude in mathematics and botany. Several botanical illustrations she produced during her schooling are now held in the Charleston Museum, showing exceptional attention to detail, particularly in her renderings of aquatic plants. After returning to Pensacola following her father's death, Eleanor lived as a recluse on the plantation property, but maintained extensive written correspondence with several notable scientists and authors of the period. Her letters reveal a keen intellect and dry wit that contrast sharply with her public reputation as a tragic, damaged figure. In one exchange with naturalist John Bartram, she wrote, "Silence, once embraced, offers certain advantages. The world speaks endlessly, revealing its nature without prompting. One needs only to listen." Eleanor never married, but historical records indicate that in the 1860s she invited a distant cousin, Margaret Leighton, to live at Magnolia Hill as a companion. The two women shared the increasingly dilapidated house until Eleanor's death. Margaret's journals, discovered among family papers in 1974, provide insights into Eleanor's daily life and unusual habits. According to Margaret, Eleanor spent hours each day sitting by the creek, where Lenora's remains would eventually be discovered, though neither woman knew of their presence there. Eleanor would bring paper and charcoal, appearing to sketch, though she would destroy her drawings immediately upon completion. She also maintained a strict ritual of placing fresh flowers in Lenora's former room every Sunday, though she never explained the significance of this practice to Margaret. Most revealing is Margaret's account of Eleanor's night terrors. She wakes in the darkest hours, her mouth open in what would be a scream were she capable of sound, Margaret wrote. When I come to her, she writes the same words on her slate. She's standing in the corner again. Her hair is still wet after all these years. I have learned to simply sit with her until dawn breaks, as no comfort I can offer seems to dispel her conviction that we are not alone in the room. These night terrors reportedly intensified in the months leading up to Eleanor's death in 1891. Margaret's final entries describe Eleanor becoming increasingly agitated, insisting on sleeping in the chair by her window rather than in her bed, with a view of the creek visible in the distance. On the night before her death, Eleanor allegedly wrote a message that she insisted Margaret burn without reading. Margaret admitted to glimpsing the first line before committing the paper to flames. I have kept your secret for 54 years, but I can no longer bear the weight of silence. Eleanor died in her sleep that night at the age of 57. The cause was recorded as heart failure, though modern medical historians have suggested that the cumulative effects of psychological trauma may have contributed to her physical decline. Margaret supervised the demolition of Magnolia Hill as stipulated in Eleanor's will, then returned to her family in Virginia, carrying with her the untold stories of her years at the plantation. The demolition of Magnolia Hill effectively erased the physical setting of Lenora's tragedy from the landscape, but could not eliminate its psychological impact on the community. For decades afterward, local residents avoided the property, particularly after dark. Fishermen reported hearing a woman's voice calling from the vicinity of the old bridge, especially during autumn nights when the temperature dropped suddenly, as it had on the night of Lenora's disappearance. Such folklore might be dismissed as typical ghost stories that often attach themselves to sites of tragedy, but the consistency of certain details across multiple accounts is noteworthy. Many unrelated witnesses describe the same phenomena: the sound of water dripping where no water was present, a sudden chill that affected only a specific area near the creek, and the faint smell of lavender, known to have been Lenora's preferred scent, according to household records from Magnolia Hill. In 1979, an attempt to develop the property into a residential subdivision failed after several construction workers refused to continue, citing unexplained equipment failures and a persistent feeling of being watched. The project was ultimately abandoned, and the land was later incorporated into a nature preserve, perhaps the most fitting memorial for a woman whose life was cut short by human cruelty, but whose story continued to affect the natural landscape she had briefly inhabited. The final chapter of Lenora Duvalier's story came in 2005, when advanced DNA testing became available for historical remains. With permission from state authorities, samples from the skeleton found beneath the bridge were compared with genetic material from descendants of the Beaufort family in Haiti, who had maintained oral traditions about an ancestor's lost fiancée in Florida. The results confirmed what circumstantial evidence had long suggested. The remains were indeed those of Lenora Duvalier. A proper burial was finally conducted, with a memorial service attended by Beaufort's great-great-grandchildren and representatives from historical societies in both Pensacola and New Orleans. The simple headstone in St. Michael's Cemetery bears only her name, dates of birth and death, and a line in French that Martin Beaufort had included in his letter to the territorial governor: La vérité, comme l'eau, trouve toujours son chemin. Truth, like water, always finds its way. Today, Visitors to the nature preserve that encompasses the former Magnolia Hill plantation can walk trails that pass near the foundations of the old house, now barely visible beneath vegetation. A small historical marker acknowledges both the site's antebellum past and the specific tragedy of Lenora Duvalier, ensuring that her story remains part of the public record rather than hidden away like Judge Patterson's papers or Eleanor's childhood diary. Academics continue to study the case as an example of how historical crimes can be partially reconstructed through fragmentary evidence, and how systems of power and privilege operated to conceal violence against marginalized individuals. The Duvalier-Layton case is now included in university curricula, focusing on historical justice, forensic archaeology, and the complicated legacies of America's antebellum period. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy of this historical tragedy is its demonstration of how truth persists despite attempts to silence it. From Eleanor's decades of mute witness to Martha Lewis's hidden journal entries, from Judge Patterson's preserved papers to the physical evidence that emerged from Creek and Bay, each fragment of the story survived to eventually form a coherent whole, giving voice to a woman who had been denied justice in her lifetime. As darkness falls over Escambia Bay and the waters reflect the same moon that shone on that November night in 1837, one might imagine Lenora Duvalier finally at rest, her story told, her remains properly honored. Yet local fishermen still sometimes speak of hearing a woman's voice on certain autumn nights, calling not in fear or anger, but as if in warning, a reminder that some tragedies, though long past, continue to resonate across time, demanding that we listen to their lessons. For in the silences of history, in the spaces between official records and acknowledged narratives, lie countless stories like Lenora's, stories of lives cut short, of justice delayed or denied, of witnesses silenced by trauma or convention. It is only by attending to these silences, by seeking out the hidden testimonies and forgotten evidence, that we can begin to construct a more complete and honest account of our shared past. The most disturbing aspect of the Magnolia Hill mystery is not the violence itself, tragic though it was, but the ease with which it was concealed, the complicity of respected community members in maintaining that concealment, and the systemic barriers that prevented the truth from emerging during the lifetimes of those involved. As you walk away from this narrative, remember that for every historical mystery that has been partially resolved, countless others remain buried in unmarked graves, locked in forgotten archives, or preserved only in the unwritten memories of those who were not permitted to speak their truth. The past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present in ways both obvious and subtle. The waters of Escambia Bay still flow beneath the modern bridge that replaced the wooden structure where Lenora spent her final moments. They carry with them sediment and secrets, memories and mysteries, continuously connecting past to present in their endless journey toward the waiting gulf. And if, standing on that bridge at dusk, you happen to feel a sudden chill or hear what sounds like distant weeping, perhaps it is not merely the wind or water, but history itself, speaking in the only voice it has, waiting for those willing to listen and remember.